Good evening, everyone. We'll just wait another minute to make sure that everyone's joined us before we get going. Okay, we'll get going and we will add people as they join. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm Hannah Randall and I am the Head of Learning at Holocaust Centre North. This event is co-hosted by both Holocaust Centre North and the University of Huddersfield's Centre for History, Culture and Memory. And I'm so glad to see you all and so many more joining. Tonight I'm joined by Professor Tim Thornton and our speaker, Simon Parkin, who will be introduced shortly. Just a few technical things to mention before we get going. I will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions, please put them there and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. We'll have about 45 minutes of the talk and then hopefully about 15 minutes for questions, and we will finish at 6 p.m. Tonight's event is recorded and tomorrow you'll receive a link for the recording and a short online survey, and we'd be so grateful for any feedback. Our host this evening is Professor Tim Thornton, who is Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University. He's also an expert in medieval history and in non-English territories of the Crown. And he's recently been published on the Channel Islands, Isle of Man and Wales, so was the perfect person to host tonight. So thank you for hosting, Tim, and I will pass over to you to introduce Simon.
Thank you, Hannah. As always, it's a pleasure to be involved. And good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome indeed to this event. As Hannah's explained, tonight we're joined by Simon Parkin. Simon is an award-winning British journalist and author. He's a contributing writer for The New Yorker, and he also writes regularly for The Guardian and The Observer newspapers. His previous non-fiction book, A Game of Birds and Wolves, was shortlisted for the Mountbatten Prize. He is indeed the recipient already of 2 awards from the Society of Professional Journalists. Now, Simon's new book, The Island of Extraordinary Captives, which forms the subject of his talk this evening, allows him to tell the story of what I think we would have to accept is history's most astonishing internment camp, Hutchinson on the Isle of Man, and about how a group of world-renowned artists, musicians and academics came to be seen as enemy aliens. It's a story of a battle between fear and compassion at a time of national crisis. It reveals how Britain's treatment of refugees during the Second World War led to one of the nation's most shameful missteps, and how hope and creativity can flourish even in those most challenging circumstances. So I'm sure you'll agree, a very promising and significant subject. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our speaker for this evening, Simon Parkin.
Thank you so much, Tim. Really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for coming and joining today. I'm just going to share my screen, which will hopefully work so you can see some of the slides I've prepared. Can you see that all right? Yep. Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay, so one spring a few years ago, I was leafing through a beige folder in the reading room at the National Archives in South London, Kew, in search of a story. I had heard about a prisoner of war camp in the Lake District, a converted stately home called Grisdale Hall, as you can see here. During the Second World War, so many captured German sailors were sent to Grisdale Hall that it became known to the locals as the U-boat Hotel. And the image of a grand English house overrun with German POWs captured my attention. I imagined it to be a bit like Downton Abbey, but with Nazis, which is a pretty compelling juxtaposition, I think you can agree. So I'd gone to the National Archives to research British POW camps. The folder I requested was filled with correspondence about the administrative difficulties of moving POWs between camps, sort of essential but quite boring war stuff. And then I turned a page and straightened. Tucked in the middle of the sheaf was the front cover of what looked like a homemade newspaper. There were hand-drawn illustrations, excitable write-ups of concerts and theatrical performances, and a long, vivid description of the experience of visiting the camp post office. The text was all in English, but while it appeared to have been produced by wartime prisoners, it included an exhortation from the editor to tell everyone that you hate the Nazis. I thought, what? Like many people, I was only vaguely aware of the fact that Britain had interned German and Austrians, Italians, and other nationalities during the Second World War. Unlike the wartime internment of Japanese Americans in North America, which is an episode of ongoing lament, the British internment of so-called enemy aliens has been mostly kept separate from the prevailing story that Britain tells itself about its wartime character. The camp newspaper appeared to offer a window into an unfamiliar alternate universe where the supposed villains were the victims and the supposed heroes the perpetrators. This document set me on a new path, not only to learn everything about this hushed world, but also to hunt for a story or a person who might compel me through the subject. Hilda Marchant was star reporter for the Daily Express, and she first heard the story from a sailor. 2 nights earlier, he explained to her, he had been standing on the deck of a ship and watched as a confetti of parachutes drifted into Rotterdam harbour. Dangling from each silhouetted disc, the sailor insisted, were German soldiers dressed not in Nazi uniforms, but in skirts and blouses. Each one of them carried a submachine gun. And when these paratroopers landed, men and women who were working as cleaners and servants emerged from basements and back doors wearing German uniforms. These individuals, the witness told Hilda, had come to Holland claiming to be refugees from Nazi oppression, but they were in fact sleeper agents posing as asylum seekers. On the 13th of May 1940, 2 days after the invasion of the Netherlands began, the Daily Express published Marchant's story under the headline, "Germans dropped women parachutists as decoys." And peppered throughout the story was the term fifth columnist. Marchant was one of the first people to adopt the phrase, which had been first coined during the 1936 Spanish Civil War, as shorthand for traitors poised to support an enemy invasion from within. British newspapers had begun to refer to fifth columnists shortly after the German invasion of Norway in April 1940, when reports circulated that spies had been installed in the country to aid the German invasion. By the time Hilda's story ran, there wasn't a reader in Britain unaware of the term or its meaning, or the notion that a similar network of duplicitous immigrants might lurk in Britain's towns. Hilda's story's claims of treachery were, it would later transpire, gravely exaggerated. But the image of the double-crossing immigrants proved indelible, and not only among readers of tabloid newspapers. The British envoy to the Dutch government, Sir Neville Bland, had also been in Rotterdam during the invasion. And when he reached London a few days later, he drafted his eyewitness report. He titled the account Fifth Column Menace, and it was vivid and fearful. No matter how superficially charming and devoted they appear, Bland wrote, every German or Austrian in Britain is a real and grave menace. When the signal is given to invade Britain, Bland continued, there will be satellites of this monster all over the country who will at once embark on widespread sabotage and attacks on civilians. Britain, Bland continued, cannot afford to take this risk. All Germans and Austrians at least ought to be interned at once. Bland's report was widely distributed in Whitehall, and a copy even reached King George VI, who summoned the Home Secretary, Sir John Anderson, for a meeting at Buckingham Palace. You must take immediate action against political fifth columnists and other enemies of the state, he said. Men and women. When the report's claims were then broadcast by the BBC a few days later, they had an immediate effect on the British public's attitude towards refugees, which until now had been broadly characterised by fragile tolerance. In April 1940, after the German occupation of Norway made an invasion of Britain seem possible, Colonel Henry Burton, Conservative member for Sudbury, asked members of the House of Commons if it would not be far better to intern all the lot and then pick out the good ones. Now, with the news from Holland, British newspapers carried the clarion call for mass internment. Act, act, do it now, blared a Daily Mail article by G. Ward Price on the 24th of May. All refugees should be drafted without delay to a remote part of the country and kept under strict supervision. You fail to realise, Price wrote, that every German is an agent. A widespread ignorance of the true number of refugees who had come to Britain, to whom Britain had offered asylum, hastened the change in public attitudes. One poll asked respondents to estimate the number of refugees who had come to Britain from Nazi Germany during the previous 6 years. Respondents put the number at anywhere between 2 and 4 million. The true figure was just 73,500. Hysteria had overcome logic. Most refugees spoke thickly accented English, were unaccustomed to British social norms, and would make pretty ineffective spies. Fifth columnists were far likelier to come from the ranks of the British fascists. As the politician Herbert Delaney Hughes wrote at the time, it is lamentable how quickly people seem to have forgotten who exactly the refugees are and how it is that they came to this country. Most British citizens acknowledged the injustice inherent in a mass internment policy, but felt it was nevertheless appropriate and justifiable. You can't say which is good and which is bad, said one respondent to a May poll, by which time half of those interviewed favoured the internment of all so-called enemy aliens. Some of them is very nice people, but it's safest to pull them all in. The British police came for Peter Fleischmann in the early hours. It reminded the teenager of the Gestapo's moonlit roundups that he had narrowly avoided at home in Berlin 2 years earlier. At that time, a kindly policeman had knocked on the gates of the Auerbach orphanage where he lived, and on the day before Kristallnacht, warned that the Nazis were coming for him. Years earlier, Peter's parents had drowned in an accident while driving by the Wannsee Lake. The couple had been writers for an anti-fascist newspaper, and Peter learned that the car's steering had been tampered with. Their deaths were apparently an act of political sabotage. Now it seemed the Gestapo wanted to wipe out the Fleischmann's only child. Peter had already quit his studies at the Royal School of Art in Berlin, so with no remaining ties, he fled to the south of the city and hid in the basement of his family's former housekeeper, while brown shirts tore through Berlin and raided the orphanage. When, 3 weeks later, the first kinder transport was arranged to bring children out of Germany, Peter, who was just shy of his 17th birthday, qualified for rescue. And on the 1st of December 1938, alongside a brood of the city's Jewish orphans, he embarked a train, watched by orphanage staff and a few Gestapo officers who had come to watch the children make their pioneering journey. At 5:30 in the morning on December the 2nd, 1938, 2 hours before sunrise, the TSS Prague cleaved the mist, hanging over the water, and docked at Parkin Quay, Harwich, on the Essex coastline. Because Peter was part of this first delegation of children to come to Britain, the world's press had turned up. So you can see here some of the raw footage that was taken that day. And we can actually see Peter among the children here. He's about to come into shot in his brown coat there, and he's carrying under his arm his art folder. As you see, he's a bit taller than the other children because he's nearly 17. There he is, getting onto the bus that's going to take him to the holiday camp where the children would await to be taken on into the homes of English families and individuals who had offered to house the refugees. Here they are disembarking at the holiday camp, and you see the children still have the tags around their necks, some of them, and one of the first things that they were doing was playing some table tennis, and there's Peter there watching the table tennis match. So in Britain, Peter, who dreamed of becoming a professional artist, was taken in by the owners of a Manchester business that specialised in colouring old photographs of young dead soldiers from the Great War. This couple provided him with employment and a room in their home. The hours were long and the conditions, a basement filled with rats and shadows, insalubrious. But the work was artist adjacent and might, Peter reasoned, provide the experience he needed to attend art school in England. In Whitehall, however, the debates surrounding the reports from Holland derailed Peter's plans. Winston Churchill, during his first cabinet meeting as Prime Minister, agreed to the internment of all male enemy aliens between the ages of 16 and 60 who were currently living within the sea-coast counties of Britain. This was the protected area on the coastline where, in the event of a Nazi invasion, a spy could theoretically cause the most harm. Men were to be interned regardless of the category that tribunals had bestowed on them several months earlier. And so the following day, on Sunday, the 12th of May, 1940, Scotland Yard's fleet of motor cars roared out of police headquarters. Many of the officers dispatched that day to make the arrests had been unaware of their tasks until they arrived at work that morning. But by the end of this first mass roundup, 2,000 refugees had been taken into custody and handed to the military authorities to be interned. John Anderson, the Home Secretary, was opposed to mass internment, and it was a position that he had hoped to hold until the war begins to go badly. Earlier in the year, he wrote to his father of the danger posed to justice by national paranoia. In wartime, people are easily worked up, he wrote. A spy scare can be started at any time as a stunt. Now, with German troops in France, the threat of enemy invasion was looming, and newspapers stewing with reports of fifth columnists. Anderson was forced to concede that there were various bodies and groups of persons in this country against whom action will need to be taken, including refugees. Throughout May, the protected area expanded from coastal counties inland, from Devon and Dorset to Dorset, Mersey to Cheshire, until no one in Britain was safe from the threat of immediate arrest and indefinite internment based purely on their nationality, ethnicity, religion, or political beliefs. Internment was in the best interest of the internee, Churchill argued, since public temper meant such persons would be in great danger if left at liberty. This argument precisely echoed the same one made by Nazi officials to justify the arrest of the party's political opponents. In a speech delivered in March 1933, shortly after the opening of Dachau, the first concentration camp, Heinrich Himmler reasoned, "I felt compelled to make these arrests because in many parts of the city there is so much agitation it is impossible for me to guarantee the safety of those individuals who have provoked it." For those internees in Britain who had survived and fled Nazi concentration camps at Dachau and Buchenwald, who were now interned by their supposed liberators, it was a befuddling injustice. And when Hitler learned of Churchill's new internment policy, he reportedly gloated, "The enemies of Germany are now the enemies of Britain too. Where are those much vaunted democratic liberties of which the English boast?" Having allowed the popular press to whip up jingoism, instead of taking an enlightened lead, the government now used public opinion as justification for strict measures. Status and class, those twin armaments of privilege, provided little protection. Nazism had pushed a wave of luminaries towards Britain in the years leading up to war. And now these Oxbridge dons, surgeons, dentists, lawyers, and celebrated artists were taken into custody. The police arrested Emil Goldman, a 67-year-old professor from the University of Vienna, in the grounds of Eton College. And at Cambridge University, dozens of staff and students were detained in the Guildhall, including Prince Frederick of Prussia, a grandson of Queen Victoria, who, while interned, received food packages from Fortnum and Mason, allegedly paid for by the royal family. That year's Cambridge law finals nearly had to be cancelled because one of the interned professors had locked away the exam papers and taken with him the key. In the early hours of the 5th of July, a black Mariah pulled up at the Presage home of Albert and Gertrude Ripkin, who had taken in Peter Fleischmann and given him work. Peter awoke to the sound of knocking. The officer's instruction was curt and urgent. "Get your clothes, come with us." Neither a soldier nor a criminal, Peter, who was one of 90 aliens and refugees arrested by Salford police that morning, was denied the civil rights that even convicts enjoy. No charge, no trial, no bail. None of his story mattered, not the fact he had been orphaned and made homeless by the Nazi regime, not the fact he had been brought to England by the British government as a destitute child, nor that he had been carefully interviewed by Lord Chief Justice Rayner Goddard, one of the most senior judges in the land, and deemed to pose no security risk to his adoptive country. In this new reality, subject to the British government's panicked measures, only Peter's nationality mattered, the same nationality the Nazis hoped to strip from him. Buffeted along a road by the winds of history, he was once again unwelcome and homeless. Peter, like many of those arrested in northwest England, first arrived at a transit camp known as Worth Mills. Massive, decaying, derelict cotton mill that cast a brutish silhouette on the Lancashire horizon. The floor, a mixture of cobbles and wood, was viscid and slippery with old machine oil, the smell of which mixed with the acrid stench of the canal that ran alongside the building. The building, which was 3 stories tall at one section, had stood empty and dampening until the British Army moved in on the 5th of June 1940. The internees arrived just 7 days later. They had ample time to take in their new home, as from Bury Station they were marched 4 miles or so along the Manchester Road towards their new home. It was a walk of shame. Hostile onlookers watched the men as they were paraded in front of the public as prisoners. Peter Katz, a pastor in his mid-50s, one of the first arrivals, said, "To be marched like a bloody prisoner of war with people watching, that really hurt. I felt degraded." By the time Peter arrived, Wharf Mills was packed. Inside, British soldiers under the command of a retired officer, Major Alfred Braybrook, sat behind a row of tables ready to check the men's belongings. The internees lined up behind the ropes, and each man was called forward. When Peter came to the table, a private grabbed his bag and tipped the contents onto the table, while a seated British officer thumbed through his wallet. Peter assumed the men were searching for any items that might be used as weapons, but it soon became clear that anything of value was in danger of being confiscated. Just as the Nazis had robbed many of these men of their valuables, so now the British officers took chocolate, cigarettes, writing paper and typewriters and distributed these items among themselves in full view of the internees. Doctors watched bewildered as the soldiers pocketed their stethoscopes. Academics argued they should be allowed to keep their textbooks. Artists pleaded to keep their drawing paper. For many of the men, this ransacking crowned a brief period that had transformed their view of Britain and their place within it. "We went around breathing injustice and feeling very sore," wrote Hirsch Uri, who was arrested alongside a number of young Orthodox Jews, most of whom had come to England via the Kindertransport. "I remember very clearly, and this was the dominating thought, the feeling of insult," noted Klaus Moser, later chairman of the Royal Opera House. "The whole operation was panicky and cruel." In Wharf Mills, 2,000 internees shared a single bathtub and 18 water taps. Laundry could be washed in an empty room, but without soap or drying facilities, clothes and blankets often emerged as dirty as they went in. Conditions in the camp were considered by the numerous German doctors among the inmates to be a liability. They wrote and co-signed a memorandum of complaint to Major Braybrook. Dr. Simon Isaac, a former professor at the University of Frankfurt, who had overseen makeshift hospitals on the Russian front, wrote that he had never seen a place less fit for the accommodation of human beings. "To be imprisoned in a building not even fit for beasts," another internee wrote, had a profound effect on the men's view of the country that had offered them sanctuary. "Many of us have ceased to believe in the British spirit of humanity, which before we had acclaimed." The indignities of isolation from friends and relatives, the meagre food rations, the lice, and the inadequate sanitary arrangements led many internees to draw parallels between the mill and the Nazi concentration camps from which they had fled. And according to an official Ministry of Information report, 2 men, both of whom had previously been incarcerated in Nazi concentration camps, died at Wharf Mills by suicide. After 1 week spent in Wharf Mills, Peter was transported to one of the more permanent camps, 10 of which were situated on the Isle of Man, and where women and children were also interned. When he reached the island, Fleischmann's home was P Camp, or Hutchinson, where around 1,200 inmates were billeted in requisitioned boarding houses that bordered a picturesque square with views that led down to Douglas Harbour. After the indignities of Wharf Mills, Hutchinson had a bucolic quality which at times felt something like a holiday camp. Hutchinson opened on the 13th of July 1940. 2 days later, some men emerged from their boarding houses carrying chairs and ladders, which they then set up around the terraced lawn. They beckoned passers-by, and when each man had a small crowd, would hold forth on their specialist subject. Soon the lawn became filled with speakers and their various audiences, like, as one observer put it, a scene from ancient Athens. A listener could wander freely between subjects, from Greek philosophy to industrial uses of synthetic fibres to Shakespeare's sonnets. Before he transferred to Hutchinson, Bruno Ahrens, an architect who had designed Berlin's highly influential modernist housing estates, organised lessons for schoolboys in his previous transit camp. Now recognizing the illustrious group of teachers in the camp's midst, he approached the camp commandant, former advertising executive Captain Hubert Daniel, and requested permission to organize a formal schedule of lectures. Daniel, who was known as Danny to his friends, offered Ahrens a room on the first floor of the camp's administration building, and together with his assistant, Dr. Klaus Hinrichsen, a young art historian, the pair assigned daily lectures, organised theatre and musical performances, and arranged lessons and tutorials for the younger internees to prepare them for the exams that they would still hopefully be able to sit whenever they were released. Ahrens christened the outfit, which was founded just 4 days after Hutchinson opened, the cultural department. But Daniel, having learned that his charges included a considerable number of eminent academics, insisted that it be known as Hutchinson Camp University. The department's remit was wide-ranging, programming lessons, arranging the borrowing of books from local and mainland libraries, and the securing of art supplies and musical instruments, and the organising of teaching of English at all grades of knowledge. There were men who would endlessly play cards or poker and smoke cigars, not moving until the next batch of food parcels arrived. But for those who chose to participate in the cultural schedule, there were rich rewards. Helmut Weissenborn considered it a miracle of human willpower how quickly the camp transformed into a kind of university that was, in the lawyer Fred Ullman's estimation, the best I had ever attended. Efforts weren't limited to academic pursuits. Captain Daniel proved to be a benevolent overseer. At the urging of his frustrated artist wife, Daniel, who was himself a keen photographer, provided materials and studio space for the artists in the camp, and he even hired in a grand piano for an outdoor matinee performance by the interned musician, the celebrated pianist Marian Ravitz. While many of the celebrated artists in the camp produced and exhibited works of art across various disciplines, and the journalists set to work publishing a fortnightly camp newspaper, which featured news, articles, fiction, and illustrations, and was edited by Leo Freund under the pen name Michael Corvin. Outside the camp in London, campaigners such as the MP Eleanor Rathbone and Hella Rota, secretary of the Artists' Refugee Committee, and the self-effacing Quaker Bertha Bracey secured for the internees books to open an impromptu library where Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca proved to be the most popular borrowed titles. They also secured for the internees a table tennis table and in time a shop where they could buy supplies and even bottles of wine. There were dozens of, this is Bertha Bracey, the Quaker, who, as you can see, was shied away from the spotlight. There were dozens of clubs in the camp for special interests, including ones for Spanish, French and Norwegian speakers, a Collegio Dante for fans of the Italian poet, and an English section run by the journalist Ludwig Elster for those who wish to become better acquainted with British life and institutions. Professional actors and film directors in the camp staged productions of, among other things, A Midsummer Night's Dream and Of Mice and Men. And to circumvent the difficulty of staging period plays without period clothing, the Hutchinson actors reinterpreted plays in contemporary settings, using modern clothing and props, roll-neck sweaters instead of livery and machine guns instead of swords, in an early example of dressing actors in contemporary fashion for a period play. Representatives of the technical school installed a speaker system throughout the camp. This was co-designed by Dr. Hans Rothfels from St. John's College, Oxford, another internee in the camp, and consisted of 2,700 yards of wire, which fed 53 speakers in each house's dining room and enabled the broadcast of radio programs from the BBC. Soon the internees began to use the radio system to broadcast their own talks. Occasionally vinyl records were played instead of an evening concert, and the system also enabled Captain Daniel to relay messages from his desk to the entire camp. Captain Daniel warmed to his role and would often announce the latest cricket scores to the rather bewildered European internees. Sometimes, tipsy from afternoon drinks, he would address the men in his garbled officer's English that many struggled to understand. The artist soon established a semi-exclusive artists' cafe housed in a laundry room extension of House 19. With its whitewashed walls and bubbling paint, the venue lacked the sophistication of the continental cafes the men were used to, but the room was sizable, and when some tables, chairs and stools were arranged inside, provided a relatively comfortable space for afternoon meetings, conversation and poetry recitals. For Peter Fleischmann, who had no ties to the outside world, Hutchinson provided the artistic education that had been cut short for him by the Nazis. Shortly after his arrival in the camp, he spotted a rather strange-looking artist in one corner of the square and watched as the man stopped people as they wandered past and offered to sketch their portrait in as little as 5 minutes for a small fee. When someone informed Peter that the man in the Loden coat was the famed Dadaist Kurt Schwitters, he was somewhat surprised by the straightforwardness of the portraits, but immediately signed up for life drawing lessons hosted by Schwitters, which were popular among those who wanted to learn to paint or who merely wanted a closer look at the celebrity. Under Schwitters' guidance, Peter painted still life canvases depicting items in his immediate vicinity, his shoes, his knife, fork and plate and flowers. Peter continued his work outside lessons, painting on the hardcover panels that he tore from the books that he borrowed from the camp library. The sculptors Paul Hamann and George Ehrlich showed him how to smuggle clay from the hills outside when he went on escorted works to remove the gritstone stand and use it to cast. Meanwhile, the woodcarver Ernst Mutter Blensdorf showed Fleischmann how to sculpt blocks of firewood. I had always wanted to learn to paint, and here was the opportunity. Peter was a quick learner, and when his painting of shoes won first prize in the camp art competition, he soon caught the attention of the other artists. I shared the conviction of the older artist that he was a natural talent, the art historian Klaus Hinrichsen noted, a born artist who just could not stop himself from working and learning. In November 1940, the artist staged a major art exhibition, timed to coincide with the opening of a new hall. It was Klaus Hinrichsen's privilege and burden to choose which works by which artists could be shown, all while ensuring that the space did not become overcrowded. It was, in short, a nightmare. Hinrichsen put it, no artist is ever satisfied with the number of his works that are accepted, nor with the space where they're shown. But for Peter, the event presented an opportunity to produce and exhibit work alongside many of Europe's finest artists, an unimaginable prospect outside the camp's warped reality. 4 of his works were chosen for display. And on Tuesday, the 19th of November at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Captain Daniel entered the exhibition, trailed by his entourage, and Peter proudly stood beside his work. Peter's experience was the exception for many of the other men who had exhibited their work in Berlin's finest galleries. They had been reduced to jostling for wall space in a remote island boarding house. But for Peter, here was the tangible fulfillment that to him captivity represented an expansion of opportunity. That he was able to exhibit was also testament to the care and support he found in Hutchinson. Despite the cultural richness in the camp, depression was rife, as the men waited for news of their loved ones, worried about their businesses outside the camp, and obsessed over freedom. Lest this all sounds too rosy a situation, Hinrichsen noted, let me assure you that all these frantic activities were entered into as a means of distraction from the ever-present anger at the injustice, the constant worry about our wives and our children left without providers, from the lack of communication, and of course suffering from cramped living conditions and the lack of freedom. In the autumn of 1940, the government released a white paper that outlined several categories under which internees could apply to be released. Those were who too young or too old, who were too infirm, or who already had permits to work in positions of national importance could now apply to be freed. But artists, writers and musicians were not included until later revisions, and even then they had to prove that they had achieved distinction in their chosen field. As Helen Rota, Secretary of the Artist Refugee Committee, put it in a letter to the Director of the National Gallery, do you think the criteria could be stretched to include those poor souls who have been too busy being hunted to achieve distinction in the arts? In Whitehall, attitudes to the mass internment policy shifted, hastened by the news of the sinking of the SS Arandora Star, when 650 men, including German and Austrian refugees and Italians as well, who had been deported to Canadian internment camps, were drowned when a U-boat torpedoed the liner. It was a shipping disaster with one of the gravest losses of life of the Second World War. And the economist John Maynard Keynes, an advisor to the government, claimed that he had not met a single soul inside or outside government departments who is not furious at what is going on. Undoing the mess was proving time-consuming and complex. In the early months of internment, the fact that so many brilliant men of self-evidently anti-Nazi beliefs had been interned highlighted the absurdity of the situation. But as the autumn nights grew longer, any sense of perverse delight turned to dismay and bitterness, as one by one the camp emptied of its celebrities. Fred Ullman wrote, "Until the weeks until Christmas and after seemed to be one endless gloom and depression. Every day I waited in fear and hope till 5 p.m. when the names of the release were announced, only to crawl back to my room, too miserable to eat." By March 1941, 12,500 internees had walked free, representing almost half of those who had been interned the previous summer. On October the 7th, 1941, 1 year, 2 months and 25 days after he arrived, Peter Fleischmann shook the commandant's hand and bade him farewell. The Artists' Refugee Committee had found him a place at Beckenham Art College, where Peter was reunited with some of his camp mentors, including Helmut Weissenborn, who had taken up a teaching post there. Toward the end of the war, Peter became a translator for the British Army and returned first to the Wharf Mills holding camp, which had been turned into a POW camp, and then at the end of hostilities to Berlin. In Berlin, he visited the Auerbach orphanage, which had been turned to rubble during an Allied bombing raid in the winter of 1943. The destruction of the orphanage had begun much earlier, however. On October the 19th, 1942, the 21st East Transport carried almost 60 Auerbach children aged between 2 and 16, along with 3 of their carers, to Riga in Latvia. In a nearby forest, SS officers executed each member of the group. Then the following month, the remaining Auerbach children left Berlin on the 23rd East Transport. This train went to Auschwitz, and none survived. After the war, everything of which Peter had dreamed since he was a young, aspiring artist at the orphanage would come true. Under his adopted name, Peter Midgley, he was accepted into the Royal College of Art, where he graduated with first-class honours, the top fine art student in his year, rewarded with the RCA's prestigious Rome Scholarship. He became a professional artist and secured commissions to create works for British government departments, Oxford, Warwick and York universities, and the Royal Navy. Nothing bettered the training he received at Hutchinson, however. Everything thereafter, he later said, was just a recap. While the internees had been relatively comfortable, internment was a near constant misery for many of them, one that, as the Oxford academic Paul Jacobsthal wrote, caused a trauma. At least 56 internees died in internment on the Isle of Man, some to suicide. And while Peter Midgley's life was transformed by the people he met during his internment, the episode also triggered feelings of abandonment and haunted his dreams. Once or twice a year, he would experience the same recurrent nightmare. He was back in the camp. One by one, everyone was released until finally he was the only one there, permanently forsaken. Every government must balance its humanitarian obligations with the need to uphold national security. But to categorize refugees from Nazi oppression as enemy aliens was to invite populist scorn and hatred upon those most in need of compassion, and represented a moral failing on a national scale. Few of the men went as far as Tristan Bush, a former internee who described the British policy as a war crime, but it is indisputable that hasty measures heaped unhappiness and anguish on thousands of people already enduring the ordeal of fleeing their previous lives. Only a single sentence spoken by Sir John Anderson in the House of Commons on the 22nd of August 1940, months before most of Hutchinson's internees were freed, provided something approaching an apology. Regrettable and deplorable things have happened, he said, as if the cruelties of internment were the result of natural phenomena and not a series of deliberate choices. In May 2021, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a formal apology to the 32,000 Italian Canadians declared enemy aliens during the Second World War, 600 of whom were sent to internment camps. There has been no equivalent attempt to repair the damage by the British authorities in failing to distinguish between refugees and enemy aliens, a dehumanizing term that in 2021 the US government pledged never again to use. The battle between a nation's responsibility to help those in need and to maintain national security persists in every age and every generation. But the notion of a refugee who is not who he or she claims is an enduring story that can be easily used to justify institutional cruelty or overreach. While the context and the detail shifts, the debate remains the same. Each generation must answer the same question. How far can we go in the rightful defense of our values before we abandon them along the way? Peter was just one individual in a camp that at its most populous numbered more than 1,200 captives, each man with his own history and legacy. And Hutchinson was just one of dozens of camps around Britain, Canada and Australia. The combined total of internees stretched into the tens of thousands. Of course, most of the men were not professors at world-famous universities or musicians who were summoned to play for royalty or artists who had exhibited across Europe. Hutchinson's population was much like any other random cross-section of society, a mixture of factory workers, artisans, teachers and intellectuals, doctors and mechanics, builders and chefs. And yet, placed in these unusual circumstances, an ordinary cross-section of society achieved the extraordinary. Together they turned a prison into a university, a camp into a cultural centre, a boarding house into an art gallery, a jumble of wires into a broadcast station, a lawn into an amphitheatre. Hutchinson became a microcosm of civilization, and the extraordinariness lay not in the accolades of each individual captive, but in how, as a collective, they embodied humanity's better urges, even while besieged by its baser ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much indeed for telling a story which I think we'll agree deserves to be far better known. And indeed, telling a story which has already prompted a couple of questions from those who are attending. Could I encourage you, if you do have any questions, to put them into the chat so we can pose them to Simon. I'm going to take them broadly in the order that I think they were submitted. So first of all, I want to Sharon's question. Thank you, Sarah, for putting in a question. Sharon's question was, Simon, were internees allowed to have money with them? Was there anything to buy with that money? Was there a camp economy, I suppose?
Yes, so in fact, there was a camp economy, and you could also write checks, and which many of the internees did to be sort of claimed after they were released. But there were in fact camp banknotes drawn up and created for many of the individual camps. You can still see some of these have the camp's name on them. There was a shop opened in Hutchinson camp where you could buy food to add to what was your daily rations that were being cooked by each house was given a dustbin filled with food each day, and if that was not enough, then you could also purchase things in the camp shop. You could pay to join to get access to newspapers once they were allowed into the camp. That was halted for a little bit, but then started to happen. And there was a deal struck, I believe, with one of the local breweries on the Isle of Man as well, who, in exchange for being able to sell their goods in Hutchinson camp, paid for the installation of a shower block as well. So yeah, there certainly was an economy. Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you, Sam. We have a question from Marion. Did public opinion about the internment of Jewish refugees change once the camp was established? And then a second part of that question, which I think touches on what you've just said, what were relationships like with local people, with the local community?
Yeah, so I mean, it changes from according to, I suppose, the war situation outside. So the atmosphere in May 1940, when the arrests start to happen, is very, very tense. This is right after the evacuation of Dunkirk, for which, you know, the Isle of Man sent boats, and so it was, you know, there was very, the threat of invasion was pervasive, and in fact everyone pretty much understood that it was not a matter of if but when. The British government handed out leaflets that described what to do when the enemy arrives. You know, it was really understood that the German army was poised to come over the channel, and so yeah, in that atmosphere, I think there was a sense of, let's just quickly intern everyone who has a German or an Austrian passport, and then we will deal with, it's the phrase used repeatedly in the House of Commons, we'll sort the sheep from the goats at that point. And, you know, the internees report arriving from Liverpool. They come across on the ferry, and the very first ones report, you know, quite a negative welcome from the local people on the Isle of Man, you know, with jeering at the dockside and things being thrown at them. And that also happens on the Liverpool side as well. So yes, not a good welcome, but that really does change throughout the summer. Part of the reason for that is the threat of the invasion sort of fades to some degree. There is also, you know, as I talked about in the talk, as the full understanding of the Arundora Star tragedy, which is in the early days taken to be, well, you know, these people aboard this ship were Nazis, so it's not that sad that a U-boat would have sunk the ship. That really starts to change when the government report comes out and it's revealed that in fact there were lots of refugees aboard, and this was a really very tragic event. That, you know, public opinion starts to change as well. There's certainly reports of people on the Isle of Man who were very generous. There's the one lady who in particular is identified for allowing the wives of internees to come and stay in her home while they're visiting. So, you know, it was certainly not all a negative response. And, you know, once things start to ease and the internees are allowed out under escorted guard, they visit the local Manx museum, they go to the cinema, and so there's a bit more interaction with the local people. And I think, you know, by that point the tone of those interactions has changed.
Excellent, thank you, Simon. We now have a question from Shabana, who, as well as passing on congratulations on an excellent talk, asks, how many men kept diaries, and are these available for the public to read?
Yeah, so yes, some men did keep diaries, and in fact that's a, you know, major source for my book. One of them I spoke about, Paul Jacobsthal, who is who taught at Oxford after he was a refugee, obviously, who came over in the years leading up to, and he kept a diary while he was interned, which he did edit thereafter. We often find Fred Ullman often also kept a diary, which is published. You can buy that. It's interesting because I think with the years after the internment saga, while it's going on, people are very sore about it. The diary entries are quite bleak and quite depressive, I would say. Then after the release, obviously Britain wins the war, and then the full sort of scale of the tragedy of the Holocaust emerges, and I think that probably sets the internment experience in a slightly different light, and so perhaps some former internees feel less hard done by it, in contrast to what happened perhaps to some of their family members who died in the Nazi concentration camps. So there is a bit of editing of diaries that happens in the decades that follow, and of course I suppose that's partly human nature, is that the difficulties that you experience start to fade and you start to focus more on the positive elements of the experience, and there were positive elements, particularly for people on the Isle of Man. So yeah, it's very, very interesting to read those. I did uncover a couple of new diaries that are not sort of available. They're not being published, but they are. If you get my book, it's all carefully footnoted, and so you can see which archives they're available in, be it London archives, or there's one outside Brighton that's got a few diaries, both in German language and English language. So they are there to be read if that's of interest.
Thanks, Simon. Shabana, that sounds like an invitation to get hold of the book in some way and to consult the bibliography, which I think will be a guide to further fascinating reading. We have a question now from Anne, who again passes on congratulations on a fantastic presentation, asks a couple of questions. The first of which is, Simon, did you come across Dr. Max Stern, art historian and art dealer, who she says was interned during your research?
That does not ring a bell. I mean, obviously I'm dealing with an awful lot of names, and in the UK edition of the book I have more than 1,200 names at the back of people that I know for certain were in Hutchinson. I'd have to double check to see if Max Stern was there. There was a chap called Siegfried Oppenheimer, I think, who was an art dealer who was in Hutchinson, who obviously took this opportunity to make good friends with a lot of the artists in the hope, I think, that he could represent them afterwards. So there were certainly, lifelong business connections were forged in the camp. And in fact, the book publisher Thames and Hudson was formed by the one former internee who he became friends with another internee in Hutchinson who said, when you get out, can you go and meet my wife and check that she's okay? So he goes to London, goes and meets the wife, and then runs off with her, and together they form the book publisher Thames and Hudson. So that came out of a dalliance at Hutchinson camp.
Thanks, Simon. I guess that might be another case for individual research to follow up on the fascinating story you told me. The second question from Anne was straightforwardly just asking where do the fascinating photographs come from?
Yeah, various sources. So as you saw, I had a photo of a camera that was owned by Captain Daniel. This meant that he took many of the photographs in the camp, which you were not allowed to take photographs in the camp. So these are the only photos that exist inside an internment camp in Britain, at least, during in 1940 and 1941. He kept those in his private collection, and then they were bequeathed when he died to the Tate. So you can go and see those photographs. It includes some photographs that are not in online, so there are a few there, and then other images come from various other sources. So Peter Fleischmann's family I was in close contact with, so some of those images come from there, the family archive, and then of course the cover of the book and the one that I showed at the end of the illustration of the man looking out to sea through the barbed wire, that's by an artist called Herman Fechenbach, who was interned in the camp, and you can go to his the people who manage his estate have run a website called, if you just search for his name, you'll see it. And that has many of the artworks that he created. He was at Wharf Mills, where he went on hunger strike and then went to the Isle of Man, so followed a similar path to Peter. And you can see some of the works that he created on that journey as well.
Thank you, Simon. We have a further question from Owen, which I think is rhetorical, but nonetheless worth asking, because I think the response will be important. Owen suggests the UK likes to think we have a long tradition of fairness and justice, when in fact, in cases like this, the record is horrifying, and he suggests nothing seems to have changed. I don't know whether you want to comment on that one, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. I think, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it does echo, as they say, and the forces that were present at this time that led to the internment policy, they are understandable in some ways, and certainly that was the view of some internees, saw it as, well, fair enough, Britain's about to be invaded. If there are some Gestapo spies posing as refugees, then better to intern all of us. But that was also not the view of everyone, and I think it was a major mistake to not treat refugees from Nazi oppression as a separate entity to so-called enemy aliens. And in fact, every refugee had been through these tribunals that ran from November 1939. For this, they had to go and stand in front of a senior member of the judiciary and tell their story, basically give an account of how they came to Britain, and then they were categorized A, B, or C. A, if the judge deemed you to be a risk and maybe you had fascist or communist sympathies. But the vast majority of people were given category C, which meant you were a genuine refugee from Nazi oppression, you pose no risk to the state. That really should have been the end of it. But of course, as I talked about at the start of the talk, all of these pressures forced, I suppose the government would say, its hand in causing, in leading to this. But yeah, it's this story, I think, is not better known because it doesn't square with the prevailing story that Britain tells itself about its role during the Second World War as a just victor fighting on the side of justice, which is true, but of course, as always, things are more complicated, and this story illustrates how.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, important reflections. I think we have time for a couple more questions, so I'll go to the question from Toby. Thank you, Toby, for your question. Toby asks whether, Simon, you have plans to write about those refugees who were, he says, in a sense, not so lucky and didn't end up on the Isle of Man, but instead got sent to Canada and Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I do include a bit of that story in my book. Certainly, you're referring there to the HMT Dunera, which was the ship that took many internees to Australia. And in fact, aboard that ship were a number of the survivors of the Arandora Star. So they'd been shipwrecked in the middle of the Atlantic, a few days earlier, and are now put on another ship that goes to Australia. And it was a terrible journey, a very notorious episode for which the officers involved, the British officers involved, were court-martialed, and in fact the Major Braybrook, who I talked about before, the commandant of Wharf Mills, was also court-martialed and went to prison for 6 months for his handling of that situation. So yes, anyway, I do refer to it glancingly. I think I had to draw a little circle around what I was going to focus on in this book, because the kind of history writing that I do is, it's called, I suppose, narrative nonfiction. So I try to just contain the story a bit in order to tell it in the most novelistic way that I could, but I understand, of course, that means that some of the stories of this saga are not fully represented. So yeah, but there are other books, particularly about the Dunera, which obviously is a well-known story, particularly in Australia. So there is other reading on some of those subjects.
Splendid. Thank you, Sam. I'm going to pause just for a second, because as I suggested, there might be time for one more question. It doesn't look as if there is, so if there are no more questions, as mentioned earlier, tomorrow we'll be sending out the recording of this session along with a short survey. We'd very much appreciate it if you can complete that survey. Hannah is going to share the link in the chat now. Those surveys do help us immensely to ensure that these events are the very best that they can be. Please remember too, there are many excellent joint events hosted by Holocaust Centre North and the university's Centre for History, Culture and Memory. There are other events planned for the remainder of this academic year, so please do follow the university's centre on Twitter. Hannah has the link and we'll share that, as also the Holocaust Centre's events, which again, I think the link is being shared. Most of all though, I do want to thank our speaker, Simon, for contributing his time, and I'm sure we all agree was a fascinating and very significant talk this evening. Thank you to you, the audience, for attending tonight, and of course to Hannah for her wonderful technical support. So without further ado, thank you very much again for attending and supporting us. I hope you all have a lovely evening. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.